Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of This Week in Global Development. I'm joined by Adva and Anna, who aren't strangers to the podcast. And this week is actually our episode just before our summer break. So next week, we won't have an episode of This Week in Global Development. So because we're going on summer break, and it's actually not summer for me, summer for the rest of you guys. But because we're going on summer break, my idea was to start to have like just good news stories this week. And Adva, I thought you had some good news for us. And I started reading the fine print of these stories and digging into it. I'm like, okay, so maybe not good news, maybe just not so bad news, which we will take for this week. So I think we're going to start off with DFC, which is the Development Finance Corporation. The Trump administration is laid out a plan for DFC. And in the first line of that story, Adva, that you wrote, I read more money. I'm like, more money? This is a first in the last couple of months. So Anna, can you break down the plan for us? What is the plan for DFC?
Sure. So it does initially look like, it is more money, and it does seem like DFC will be one of those agencies that might emerge as a relative winner if President Trump's proposal comes to pass. But whether it's good for development overall still remains a question. There are concerns. On the one hand, that cap that you mentioned, the maximum portfolio size would go from 60 billion to 250 billion. So it's a very substantial increase. On the other hand, development advocates are worried about some of the specific proposals in the plan and some of the reforms, and that includes being able to invest in high-income countries. That's one point I thought that was really interesting, which is a big change. Not a huge change. DFC does get to invest in upper middle income countries with some caveats to it, but its primary remit is to invest in lower income countries. And there's a real concern that basically poorer countries will be left to fend for themselves here. And that prospect, is also reinforced by the fact that the Trump's proposal emphasizes national security objectives, and it doesn't, as Adva pointed out in her article, it doesn't mention much about development objectives. And I think this really syncs up with the overall foreign policy approach of the administration. It's more transactional. That includes development, obviously. So again, there is this concern. It's a valid concern that poorer countries will not align with this strategy that the administration is proposing. Adva can get into more detail about the fact that there has been this push to expand the number of countries that DFC can operate in. But again, it's not been a push specifically for high-income countries. And just one last thing, I thought it was interesting that was mentioned in the article. The organization Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network made a set of recommendations, and one of them was specifically regarding this, and that it would require DFC to report on an annual basis if more than a third of its project commitments are in upper middle income or high income countries. So again, people are looking at this like, let's make sure there's a balance and that lower income countries are not left behind. And that's a real concern based on this proposal. So good and bad, very nuanced.
I think that sort of conversation is going to be very live in Congress as they try to sort of hash out what the reauthorization of DFC would look like. Because it's important to note, like, this is the Trump administration's proposal, but there are other proposals that lawmakers in Congress have put forward. In fact, the House passed a version last year. I know that there's, a version being developed in the Senate, and there are some differences between the various proposals and what advocates are pushing for. So I think one of the things you will see is a discussion about putting guardrails around, the income level of a country and how, sort of what percentage of the portfolio that might be. I think that could be a conversation. But we have seen in some of the previous iterations of proposals and in the conversations on Capitol Hill that people do want to sort of expand the number of countries DFC could work in. And one of the issues is that while it has been allowed to work in upper middle income countries, as Anna said, the process has been quite complicated. It had to be approved by the State Department. And that was a very slow process. And so people really complained about that being inefficient and not very effective way to do things. And so I think that, a lot of the things in this proposal are aimed at fixing things in the original bill that created the agency that haven't quite worked as they should. Now, some of them, expanding the maximum contingent liability, the amount it can invest, is just to allow it to continue to grow. Because what we know right now is that DFC has a portfolio of about $49 billion, and its cap is $60 billion. This year, its investments have sort of slowed down. In fact, they kind of ground to a halt at the beginning of the year once the Trump administration came in, and they're just moving quite slowly. So I don't think they would hit that cap this year, but there was a real concern at the end of the last fiscal year, so around, October, November of last year, that the DFC would actually within a year hit that cap and not be able to make new investments. So that is something that's fairly urgent for the agency to be able to increase that cap. Some of the other things that we saw is there has been a long debate about equity at the agency. We've heard this probably since the first or second year after it was created. It was granted equity authority, but then there was sort of a debate among the budget officials who didn't want to allow the agency to essentially treat equity the way it treats loans, which is to take a pool of money and using some calculations based on, what they think the risk of loss is, invest with that money. So a small pool of money allows them to invest a lot. But instead, the budget official said, no, for equity, you have to score it like a grant. So essentially assume that you're going to lose all the money, which is highly unrealistic. In fact, they're very likely to make money on it. But because of that, Congress has to appropriate 1-for-1 every dollar they do for equity, which really limits the amount of equity that the agency can provide. And it's a very useful tool. It allows them to, better meet needs, participate earlier on in investments, work better with other DFIs. And so it's something that people have long said, we have to fix this equity issue. That sort of scoring pathway has been really challenging and really hasn't made a whole lot of progress. The budget officials, including in Congress, are kind of dug their heels in on that. So what's emerged is a proposal, and the Trump administration puts this forward, of a revolving fund, but it's something that we'd heard in the past before. And the idea is that this would be capitalized up front. I think the Trump administration in its budget proposal said maybe $3 billion, and then that would be kind of recycled. So as those funds come back in, as the equity investments make money, the DFC would get that money and be able to retain it and then invest it again. So it's just sort of another way around it to allow it to get more equity. I think there is a fundamental question about where do you find $3 billion in a really, really tight foreign assistance budget that's already been slashed. So I think that will be a live conversation, sort of the size of that. Some of the other technical fixes, right now, for any project over $10 million, the DFC has to notify Congress, and that means that Congress can then ask questions or put a hold on a project, and that has also slowed things down, that additional layer of review. And so I think quite a number of people I've talked to want to see that threshold increased. The Trump administration suggests increasing it to $100 million. That's 10x what it is today. Some people are skeptical that Congress is kind of going to give away that much of its oversight authority. So we might see it, there may be compromises in some of this, right? So maybe it's 50 million, not 100 million. And then a couple other things. The DFC's predecessor used to be able to keep the fees it charged to pay for administrative expenses and things like that, or monitoring and some of its analyses. The DFC, a lot of people think it was an oversight, did not get that authority. So this would change that. So it would allow it to retain its fees. In theory, that should mean that it needs less money in the annual appropriation cycle because it's able to sort of keep and fund some of those administrative expenses through the fees. And it also wants more flexibility in hiring. It wants to have more, be able to hire more people as administratively determined positions, which essentially means that they don't have to follow sort of the strict, rigid government pay scales and contracts. And they want that in particular because they want to be able to attract top level talent. A lot of folks who would work at a DFC could also work in, private banks and investment banks, et cetera. So they want to be more competitive. And I think, I think there's mixed opinions on that. I talked to someone who said they already have a fair number of these positions. So we'll see. But that's another thing they're asking for. I think fundamentally, this is an interesting proposal. A lot of things do sort of overlap with other things we've seen in other proposals. I think it's just about sort of the nitty gritty and where do you end up on some of these discussions. And I think the fundamental thing is, and one of the reasons I wrote this story now, other than, of course, I obtained the government's plans, is that the DFC is on a clock. Its current authorization expires on October 6th. Congress is the House is already out for what they call their August recess, their August break, where they spend time in their home states. And the Senate is likely to leave soon, though that's perhaps a bit up in the air given some politics and discussions happening. But because of that, there's really very few legislative days left on the calendar to get anything pushed through. So people who I was talking to the last week or two, they really think that what's going to happen with the DFC is there's going to be a temporary extension so that its authorization doesn't lapse. And, we're unlikely to see sort of a long-term budget bill. So what we'll probably see is a continuing resolution that sort of buys another, 3-4 months, 2-3-4 months for Congress to agree on the budget. That continuing resolution, you could sort of tack on a DFC extension to that. So that seems a likely pathway, but I think we'll see. It just doesn't seem, given the political processes that still need to happen around a sort of authorization bill, that will happen by October 6th. Now, if nothing passes in Congress and DFC's authorization lapses, the agency can't continue to work. Now, it will still hold the investments that it holds, but it won't be able to make new investments. There's questions about whether it would be able to fulfill payments on investments it's already promised. And the fundamental thing is DFC works with the private sector. The private sector wants certainty and to be able to trust the people that it's working with. So if an authority lapses, the private sector isn't going to know that the DFC is a reliable partner. And that sort of reputational damage could actually last a lot longer, even if there's only a short-term lapse in the authorization. So those are some of the issues that we're looking at now. I think there's quite a few dynamics at play in the discussions around this. I do think the high-income country conversation will be a debate about where that goes. And one other thing I wanted to mention on that, the current DFC processes for investment, they have to prove what's called additionality, that essentially their finance is essential to making a deal happen, that it couldn't be financed in the commercial markets. And that's a much harder case to make in high-income countries. We've seen it in the past when Congress has pushed them to invest, for example, in energy in Eastern Europe, where it's actually been hard to find investments that meet its current criteria. So I think there's questions about if it is allowed to invest in high-income countries, do they change the criteria for investment in those countries in general? Do they keep their sort of development analysis that they use to make investment decisions? One person said to me, there's a real question about whether it actually continues to be a development bank or whether it's sort of just a U.S. foreign policy bank. So I think some of those things will be live discussions, and we'll have to see how some of that plays out. And I think some of the challenges are also because the DFC is waiting on its CEO. He's had his hearing, but he's waiting for an official vote in the Senate, though the folks I've talked to expect that to happen soon, probably sometime in September at this point. But yeah, I think that will also make a difference in sort of how things are working at the agency and how this process plays out.
I think that really sums up my thoughts when I read this story. Like, does it remain a development bank if some of these changes happen? And yeah, well, another interesting story that you wrote, Adva, and quite in contrast to what's happening with DFC is what's happening with MCC. So MCC is going to survive, which is somewhat good news, but on a much smaller scale. Anna, can you explain what's going to happen to MCC?
Sure. It's like DFC, MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation generally enjoyed bipartisan support, but as you said, they're kind of on two different tracks. At least that's what it appears like. In general, just for some context, MCC was seen as kind of by both parties as a way to motivate, encourage countries to improve their governance, improve their economic outlook, because they only qualified for grants, and some of these were very large-scale grants, if they fulfilled a specific set of indicators such as, tackling corruption, increasing civil liberties, etc. So it's been seen by many as a very kind of accountable, sustainable way of doing development. And so it is a kind of in its own way, it's not a huge agency, but it's a popular agency. It wasn't an obvious candidate, I think, for elimination, outright elimination, until you had, as Adva reported, you had Elon Musk and DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, kind of tell senior leadership that there will be cuts to programs, to the staff. And this obviously triggered a whole lot of fears that MCC could be on the way, closed, just the way that at the time, USAID was being shut down, and that really surprised a lot of people. But now that the administration has concluded its foreign assistance review, it looks like it's recommending not that the entire agency be shuttered, but that about half of its programs are on the chopping block. So again, that's a huge hit. Just like it'd be a huge, great thing for DFC, it would be a huge blow for MCC. And, as Adva pointed out in her article, critics say there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to some of these cuts. And I think what's interesting to point out is, as we often do the China angle here, the administration has said that the goal here is to align the agency with its America First policy. And obviously that's, sounds great. It's like Secretary of State Marco Rubio often says, to make the country safer, more secure, more prosperous. But I think few people will disagree with that in concept, but it's the specifics. How do you figure out what programs actually qualify, actually align with that? And I think, in the past, a lot of MCC programs were seen as, a way to counter Chinese hegemony especially in the global South. So it's confusing to some people that you would get rid of programs in certain countries that are seen as geostrategically important to both China and the US. And I suspect that this is an argument that Democrats in Congress have already started to make and will continue to make in terms of, hoping that these cuts will not be as draconian as proposed by the administration.
The things I want to just jump in and say is that I definitely spoke to people this week who were like, this is a win. Like, the agency is not eliminated, and that has to be, celebrated, right? Because I do think in April, people thought the agency was going to be eliminated. And there was a behind the scenes, I've heard some details of really high level behind the scenes push campaign to, talk to administration officials, talk to the Secretary of State to say, you need to intervene and prevent MCC from being shuttered. And the reality is in Congress, it does still enjoy bipartisan support. And one of the things that was striking is in the House appropriations bill for foreign assistance that we saw, they funded MCC at the same levels as the past 2 years, as the past number of years, at $900 million. So they fully funded the agency, which is a strong signal that Republicans in the House believe that it's important, right? So I think it does still enjoy support, which is probably the reason it hasn't gone away. If we want to dive a little bit into some of the programs that have been recommended for termination, now the board has to make that ultimate decision. The board is likely to meet in late August, I'm told. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio chairs that board. My understanding is that the foreign assistance review of MCC was largely led by the State Department. It was not conducted by MCC itself. And so I think, at least one person I talked to said a lot of the programs on the, potential termination list are in Africa. Look, a large portion of MCC's programs are in Africa, so perhaps that's why. But one of the people I spoke to said that, this might have been a case of the Africa Bureau really not making a strong enough case for why these programs were essential. And maybe there is an opportunity to still change minds on some of these things. But, Anna mentioned the China angle. There were sort of proposed either compacts or threshold agreements in Indonesia, Philippines, and Zambia, all three countries which are considered fairly strategically important vis-a-vis China, that are slated for elimination. So those types of programs people are curious about. I will say that a fair number of the programs that were slated for elimination are either what are called threshold agreements, which are essentially smaller grants to countries that don't yet qualify for MCC's scorecard to help them address sort of key policy barriers, with the idea that hopefully they would then eventually qualify for a compact. So in some cases, in quite a lot of these were threshold agreements. A couple of them were regional compacts. DFC only got that authority fairly recently and has had challenges with regional compacts. With in some of these cases, some of the parties in the regional compacts have like had coups, and so then part of them have been canceled. So there's dynamics at play in some of this, but I think one of the people I talked to summed it up in a way that was useful, which is these threshold agreements and some of these compacts that were at an early stage, right, not being implemented yet, are a little bit of low-hanging fruit. They're easier in a sense to get rid of or cancel than something that's a lot further down the line. And so maybe that was, if you're looking for logic, maybe that's part of it. But, I think one of the fundamental questions I've heard, and my understanding is that people at the agency really don't know, like, what does the future look like? Okay, if you terminate about half of the programs, will MCC choose new countries? Will MCC enter new agreements? Is this like, we're going to terminate these because we don't like what they focus on and the terms, and we're going to go back to the country and negotiate a new compact? Will MCC change its scorecard to allow it to work in more places? That's a question, right? Is this a moment for reform or to really, change the dynamics of the agency? So I think there's a lot of questions about what this means for MCC. I think some key moments later in the year, typically November, MCC publishes its scorecards for all of the countries that could potentially be eligible. And one other important thing to note is actually the candidate pool, the number of countries MCC can work in, was expanded only last year by Congress at the end of last year, right? So it does have like this broader pool of countries it can now work in. So will we see scorecards released in November? And then at the December board meeting, where they normally select new countries for compacts or threshold agreements, will we see the administration select countries to begin the development process? So I think that there's some fundamental questions about what next. Okay, this agency continues. Congress seems to want to appropriate money to it. If all of these programs are terminated, it's also going to have money that it had planned to expend. So what happens from a budget perspective? What happens from a new program perspective? I think there's a lot of questions about what next. But I guess what we do know for now is that MCC is sticking around. And for a lot of people, I think that's a win. And then I think, as Anna said, it's an agency that has been historically quite data-driven. It's quite a lot smaller than some of, it had at the start of the year, I think only around 300 people. I've heard something like a third of those people have left through various, buyout offers, early retirement, etc. So it's an even leaner team than it was. So I think that there's, questions ahead, but we'll see sort of what happens on these fronts.
So one of the questions I've had since January, and I'm sure a lot of people like in our sector have the same question and probably don't have an answer as yet for it, is what does America First actually mean? How do you actually make that case? Like we spoke about the Africa Bureau and maybe the Africa Bureau not actually making a strong enough case for projects within African countries, but how do you actually make that case, and exactly what kind of things align with an America First policy? Do you think there's more clarity now with like what's happening with like DFC and MCC and sort of what happened with PEPFAR and the rescissions package? Is there more clarity on what goes and what doesn't go, or are we still like in a state of confusion right now?
I think there's still questions. I think there's certain things that we know don't align. Like one of the interesting things is I do think some of MCC's compacts, for example, will change. So I heard, for example, they want to change the Belize compact to align with America First. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but there was a climate component, a big focus on renewable energy in the Belize compact, on solar energy and solar energy storage. So maybe they don't love that focus and they want to change some of the language or change some of the underlying dynamics. You could see that being a way to align it with America First. I do think there's a fundamental question of how important this administration thinks African nations are to its security to its place in the world, etc. One of the people I spoke to, I asked, is this just like a signal that the administration doesn't care about Africa, right? And I think there are some really interesting examples. Like one of the compacts that is on the termination list is Lesotho. And Lesotho has actually been really hard hit by this administration's policies. The tariffs have hit Lesotho really hard, and the expiration of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, is a major trade deal which gave preferential treatment to Lesotho in terms of importing into the US, is going to really, really hurt the garment sector, which is critical to that country's economy. So to add this as a potential blow on top of that is also, really challenging. So I think there is a question about where do African nations come in. Now we've seen the administration say that, for example, it supports projects like the Libido Corridor. Now, one of the compacts that's on the termination list is Zambia, which is a critical part of that Libido Corridor. And some of those MCC projects probably would, were focused on agriculture. And part of the idea of expanding this corridor is that then you would have better avenues for exporting agricultural goods and things like that. So there's definitely tie-ins. So that's also why there's a question there, right? And it is a place where, China has a foothold. And I think part of the Libido Corridor is about the US sort of saying we're a valuable partner. So I think to answer your question, I don't have a very clear sense exactly of what that means, or maybe it means one thing in some contexts or in others. Hopefully we'll learn more. I think one of the questions is, when do they start making State Department, MCC, any of these agencies really start making new contract awards or new grants or things like that? And then we'll have a better sense of like what they want to do versus what they don't like, right? Which is a lot of the input we've had so far.
And I think, to be fair, a lot of people don't know. There's, it's not just MCC and DFC. It's all kinds of U.S. agencies wondering if their programs fit into America First. And obviously, that's a huge question for the State Department. And, in the past, some of these traditional arguments of, for instance, in fragile, conflict-affected states, you want to prevent wars from breaking out. So you want to invest in these countries because eventually, if a huge regional war does break out, the U.S. might get sucked into that. But that argument, doesn't seem to really resonate like it used to in previous administrations. And so you're seeing exits out of Mali, out of a lot of other African countries, as Adva said. And you're seeing the countries that have critical minerals, for instance. That's a huge one. There's so much more interest there. So it does kind of go with this theme that it's very transactional. What can benefit, at least mutually benefit, American interests and the country's interests. And that's what development advocates seem to hope, is that it's mutually beneficial. But is it going to be one-sided? I feel like nobody really has a clear-cut answer on that.
I think one thing I would add, and I think MCC is a really good example of this, I don't know that there's always sort of clear agreement or understanding across the administration as well. Because, for example, at MCC, there were mixed signals. I think folks at the agency thought they would be okay, and then DOJ came in and said no. So I think sometimes one part of the administration is putting forward a specific policy or has a specific set of ideas, and that might be different than another agency or another group of people. So I think that's also a dynamic to watch as we try to figure this out.
Quite interesting. And also on the administration front, something else happened this week. I think it's 2 lawsuits. Am I correct? Some of the lawsuits against the Trump administration were dismissed. These were lawsuits about the dismantling of a USAID. Can you give us some of the details around that, Anna? Because I found the reasons why quite interesting, and I'm wondering what happens next.
Yeah, I mean, as most people know, on a national level, in terms of Supreme Court, President Trump has won a string of victories. So this is a bit more niche to our community. But as you said, 2 lawsuits were dismissed by federal judge Carl Nichols. And these lawsuits tried to block the USA dismantling, but he ruled that the court lacked jurisdiction over the claims, which were brought by organizations representing USAID employees and contractors. So basically, he said that these workers were seeking personnel-related injuries that could be resolved through other mechanisms outside of the courts, or at least his court. He also said that the plaintiffs failed to demonstrate irreparable harm, among other things in the ruling. So basically, the lawsuits accuse the administration of overstepping its constitutional authority by freezing aid programs, putting thousands of staff, on contractors on leave, and attempting to fold USAID into State Department. So it was a big lawsuits. These are very big questions that they brought up. Originally, I think it's, important to note the plaintiffs made a little bit of progress. Some of these firings were paused, but ultimately that was only temporary. By February, Nichols cleared the way for thousands of staff to be put on leave.
Yeah, and I was in some of those early hearings, and
they were optimistic.
I think the issue early on was that Nichols was concerned about the safety of employees, particularly those abroad.
Right.
Because initially it was like, people need to return immediately, and then it was like, what if people have health issues and their kids? And there was just so much confusion over how quickly people would have to be brought back. It was like 30 days. And so I think that initial sort of temporary restraining order that was seen as a win in these cases was really about this security issue. And then once he felt like that was resolved, it was sort of clear in those hearings that this probably wasn't going the way of the plaintiffs, because he sort of indicated this earlier on in the process, that he didn't think that they had standing because there are other processes in the federal government to allow employees to do things. Now, one of the challenges here is that, does this mean that now each of these individual employees has to pursue an individual claim, right? Because this would have been sort of as a class, as a group of employees. And then what are the legal fees like on an individual level? What does that mean? Doesn't it make it hard? Right. So I think there's some questions that come out of this, but I think he felt, like you said, because it's a personnel issue, and that's where it's different from some of the other lawsuits that are still moving forward. It's about who is bringing the lawsuit. So I think that's important. And I think he felt like this particular group of people could not claim the claims that they were making, and that sort of negative impacts could have been mitigated through other processes.
And remember, most are fired. Unfortunately, most have been severed from the agency as of July 1st, with just a handful moving, a few hundred moving to the State Department. So the train has already left the building in a lot of ways, but this ruling kind of solidified, if you will, determinations.
Yeah, and even though a lot of those employees have left, I have heard, at least anecdotally, that there are sort of ongoing issues with, a lot of them are supposed to get severance packages, and that there are still, when they were given their reduction in force or RIF notifications, a lot of those RIFs had errors. And for some people, those errors still haven't been corrected. They're now locked out of systems. There's a question of if they'll get credited for the time that they've actually served and get the money that they are supposed to get. Will they have to sue to get it? So I think there are still questions about sort of how that process played out, but they now have to seek, to address that in other sort of more administrative court processes outside of the federal courts.
And one thing I'm curious about, and I think you'll come back to this question, is which court cases are continuing? And then also, in addition to that, we also published another story from our colleague Alyssa, who wrote the story about the lawsuits about the director of acquisitions and assistance. She released a memo which kind of confirms a lot of the things that people were suspecting about the process of dismantling USAID. She basically said contract officers were ignored throughout the process. There's no way that Marco Rubio could have reviewed each and every one of the terminations that were, each and one of the programs that were terminated. And she highlighted like a series of processes and things that happened, which people suspected, with evidence attached to that. So what does this mean for the court cases that are continuing, and which ones are actually able to continue?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So one of the big cases we've been following is the case that was brought by USAID implementers, a large group of implementers that are both sort of NGOs and for-profit implementers. And that case is moving forward. The plaintiffs in that case have won some, judgments from the judge. And I think this particular sort of bombshell document could really help in that case, because it sort of goes against some of the things that the administration has been saying, including in court. And in those proceedings, the fundamental thing that they're looking at is actually whether the government legally could cancel these contracts, whether the government legally can choose not to spend money that has been appropriated by Congress. And the administration has continued to promise that it is actually going to spend this money before the end of the fiscal year. I think there are a lot of questions about whether that's actually going to happen. And at least my understanding, obviously I'm not a lawyer, is that some of those things can't, like, the court in some respect has to just trust that the administration is going to do that, and they can't do anything about it until that has been violated. So until the end of the fiscal year, if the money hasn't been appropriated, then there might be additional recourse, because you could actually say that they didn't spend the money and they violated that law, right? That Congress has the power of the purse. So I think with this document, you know, the fact that it sort of clearly lays out that, you know, the appropriate processes weren't followed, that sort of the legal ways of dissolving programs weren't followed, that there weren't justifications that were followed, that really, fundamentally, there was no real foreign assistance review, or at least that she could see or that she got information about that would inform this. And then it challenges, you know, the truth that the administration has put forward, their version of the truth on some of these things, right? So I think that could definitely play a role in the court case. I know Alyssa spoke to one of the attorneys who's involved in that big implementer case about this, and I imagine it's something that they will look to sort of put forward. And I think one of the things I'll say is that anecdotally, I know Alyssa and I, for a couple months, had been hearing some of these things, right, from contracting officers. But the fact that it's someone at the level that is sort of publicly drawing attention to these things, I think it holds a real weight. And I think we'll see what happens. I think also, is there some take up in Congress, for example, right, to sort of do additional oversight to better understand this process. But I think it will play a key role in particularly that implementer lawsuit. So there's a number of other legal challenges that are continuing, not just related to USAID, but related to some of the other aid-related agencies.
And I'll just quickly add, I mean, Eva summed it up really well. You know, the attorney representing the USAID partners, I forget her name, but suing the Trump administration, you know, she said the memo confirmed what they have been arguing all along throughout the case, that the administration terminated awards en masse, not on an individualized basis. You know, and there was, you know, longtime doubts that Secretary of State Marco Rubio didn't exactly personally approve of thousands of awards seemingly overnight. So, you know, I can't say whether this will be used as evidence, but I think, you know, strongly suggests it will be. And it's a pretty damning memo. You know, she herself says these are potentially illegal orders that she's found quite a bit of evidence of. So, again, I think it's damning is kind of the word that sums it up for this memo. Makes
me think I should check the court record to see if they've submitted it or submitted some sort of document related to it, because I do think they'll use it sort of to, for lack of a better word, impeach some of the statements the administration has made or to counter them. But we'll see. Obviously, the lawyer's name is Lauren Bateman. I didn't speak to her. I know Alyssa did. So I think we'll see what or how they choose to use it, but I'll be keeping an eye on that docket.
And an interesting nugget in that docket is that when they were ordered to make payments to contractors, that didn't actually happen, and which a lot of people were saying. But I think it's quite interesting now that there's evidence that didn't actually happen.
I mean, we do know that some of the payments have been made, right? And we know that from the plaintiffs, right? They have told the court that some of the payments have been made. It took a long time for them to start moving and pressure from the court for that to happen. But just, you know, I mean, I think there are still some outstanding payments. I don't know exactly what the latest on that is. But a good number of the outstanding payments from before February 13th to these plaintiffs has now been paid. But it did take quite some time.
Yeah. So I think that kind of sums up what we should be on the lookout for. So I think one thing that we definitely need to be on the lookout for is this court case from contracting officers. And is there anything else that we should be watching out for in terms of DFC and MCC, Adva?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the MCC front, let's see when the board meeting happens and sort of what the final decisions are on some of these things, whether there's any changes or discussions or flexibility. On DFC, I think the real question is there sort of a huge push and momentum around some sort of plan before October 6th, or do we see actually just a sort of short-term stopgap extension? I highly doubt that nothing's going to happen there. One of the people I spoke to said it would be a travesty if DFC isn't reauthorized, in part because it actually is one of the few areas where there's bipartisan like agreement on something related to development, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that's more of a September thing, but really to watch what happens with the reauthorization. And I think in general with these agencies, do things start to move more? What do the sort of, fourth quarter DFC investments look like? Is it starting to pick up? Are we seeing for MCC the scorecards happening like they normally do? Do we see countries being selected? I think a lot of these sort of what's next. And I think similarly at the State Department, do they start issuing new awards related to some of these areas that they've absorbed from USAID, right? So I think we haven't quite seen some of that yet. I think there were rumblings that the State Department is starting to issue some awards, and but I think we'll see on some of these issues where things go. But for now, it's kind of a sit tight, at least for the next few weeks. And in DC, August tends to be a bit quiet, but you never know.
Yeah, I don't think any of the months have been quiet this year, but I think that's quite interesting, like watching out for new awards, because I think we're getting a sense of what the administration doesn't want, and hopefully we'll begin to start getting a sense of what they do want. And Anna, anything you're particularly on the lookout for?
Well, I think, Adva summed it up really well in terms of, August tends to be slow, but you never know. September, you've got the budget talks. And unlike with DFC, MCC, where there's a lot of bipartisan consensus, there is not a lot of bipartisan consensus on the budget. And obviously you have the international affairs budget. You have how much the different proposals for the State Department budget will be. So really, we're talking about money, a lot of money, potentially being cut or being preserved. And so I think that's going to be really interesting. And as Adva said, there are not that many legislative days. Will there be an agreement by the end of September? People are highly doubtful for good reason, if history is any indicator. And so again, there's just going to be this really ongoing, probably, I think, long-standing tussle over funds.
Yeah. And we'll have to see where the Senate comes in, right? We've seen the House bill at this point. It's made its way through committee. So I think we'll have to see, what the differences are in the Senate bill, and then how do you sort of square those differences or come to some sort of compromise. We haven't seen a budget passed within the regular budget window in quite a long time. So that's why I don't expect it. I think we will get a continuing resolution. I think one other thing to be watching is in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, they're having a lot of discussions about a State Department reauthorization. And there are some thoughts that maybe a DFC reauthorization would move alongside a State Department reauthorization. But a State Department reauthorization is also a really big deal. There hasn't been one in a long time. It could really change the sort of structure of the agency. And so I think that that's something to really watch, especially in this moment where it's absorbed USAID, right? What does a reauthorization look like? What role does development play in that?
So much to look out for. And just as a reminder, we will not be having an episode next week of This Week in Global Development. We are on our summer break, which we'll see if it's going to be a quiet summer break. But we will be back the week after that, and we'll be giving you more details on all the things that we're following. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me. And yeah, we'll see you guys after the break.
Thanks for me.